Sean Haney and Justin Funk here with Real Agri Studies, and it's time to break down the July 2023 results for the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. I want to thank all of you, the respondents, for filling out this month's survey so we can get a sharper idea as far as what's going through your head, how you feel about the current market, how you feel about your current finances, mental health, and a whole lot more. So really do appreciate that. And Justin, let's dig in and see what farmers said across Canada.
Yeah, you bet. So this is our July sentiment index. We fielded this starting around the 20th of July and kept it open for about a week. So that gives you an idea of the time frame that we're looking at where we collected these responses. Overall, 593 of our panelists completed this survey. And so we thank you very much for that. Just for some of you, this may be your very first one. So here is just a small overview of what we're trying to do. The Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index is modeled after the Purdue Ag Economy Barometer, but it's done with a Canadian point of view with Canadian farmers. And so we've built this to get insight as to how farmers feel about things like their financial situation on the farm, their outlook on the economy, how they feel about the government or markets, and also the state of mental health, which we'll get to here in a few moments. And so we do this every 2 months, and the idea is to ask the same questions the same way, so that we can get an idea of, where is the benchmark and how are we moving the needle from period to period, and also as we observe changes that are happening in the market itself. So in this instance, we got 593 farmers who answered the question. And just so people understand, that gives us a degree of accuracy of plus or minus 4%. So we look at these results as being representative of the Canadian agricultural marketplace. So in this survey, we focused on the following. We looked at both current and future financial performance of the farm, the outlook and optimism towards the Canadian ag industry and the ag economy, willingness to make investments in the farm, people's perspective on risk management in both the grain and livestock markets, and the state of mental health. Sometimes we ask questions around government assessment. We didn't do that this time. We wanted to focus on these things. When we do this, we ask the questions in a way that there's a positive response and a negative response, and sometimes a neutral response, not in all cases. But what we do is we subtract the positive from the negative, and that gives us a differential, which we then add to 100, which now gives us our index. And so the range can be anywhere from 0 to 200. And when we look at something in the 100 range, that's considered to be neutral. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this one, what's special about this report, is that this is our 6th iteration of the sentiment index. And so this will give us now an entire calendar year worth of insight, which we can now establish our annual benchmark number. And so that will be coming shortly, and people will get to see what does the average year sort of look like when it comes to these things. So what we're going to be sharing are the index numbers. And so this gives people an idea. When you answer the questions, and here's an actual result. Very first question, would you say that your operation today is financially better off, worse off, or about the same compared to a year ago? Well, 24.5% of you said that we're better off. 28.8% said that we're worse off. And then the rest of you said we're about the same as we were 12 months ago. So when we subtract the negative from the positive, we're left with a differential. In this case, it's negative 4.3. We add that to 100. That gives us a negative index of 95.7. So we round that up to 96. And so that's our current farm financial performance index number for July. Okay. So what we're going to be walking you through here is not just this month's numbers, but we're going to look at it relative to the previous month's numbers as well. So here's our neutral line of 100. Okay, so anything that falls above this line is considered positive. Anything that falls below this line is considered negative. So, Sean, you ready to go?
Let's get to it.
Okay, so historically, with our current farm financial performance, we've seen this one bounce around from September through to May. It got up pretty high in January, so during the winter months, and then sort of settled back down in our last intake For this month, we see ourselves continuing a slight decline into negative territory now at 96. And so our conclusion here, Sean, is that farmers are, relatively neutral, but somewhat negative when it comes to their farm's current financial position relative to a year ago.
Yeah, it's kind of maybe a bit of a natural way to look at things, right? We don't necessarily have the crop in the bin, so to speak. So there's still things that can go wrong there. As we're always trying to manage the negative, it seems, in farming and ranching. But at the same time, we have areas of the country, Western Canada, for example, that has faced, lots of adversity when it comes to dryness. We have some other pockets in central and eastern Canada that have had too much rain. And wanting that tap to shut off, really both ends of the pendulum there when it comes to Mother Nature and precipitation that she has provided. So in some ways, this makes a lot of sense to me. If we were at 140, I would find it strange. And if we were at 60, I would also find that, man, we are way too negative about the situation. So neutral seems about right.
Yeah. So looking ahead, with respect to future financial performance, one observation that we have made is that this has consistently been in negative territory. We saw in the last intake the number recede back to where it was in our very first intake. You can see 74 and 74 there. In the July intake, we saw this number come back up into the 84, 85-ish territory. And so, I think what we're probably going to see here is that the benchmark is going to be around 85, which is, negative, but it's not so overly negative. It's almost like a cautious negativity, if you will. We don't want to put, too much stock into this, but I think people are somewhat conservative when it comes to how they think about, what comes next.
Yeah, I think, when we think about future farm financial performance, this is where we're making kind of an estimate of the variables that we have to deal with, right? So where are the markets going? What's going to happen with the weather? Trying to, make everything happen that I need to on the farm or ranch. And I think we've well established it, like you said, we've well established that future farm financial performance is in Canada has a more pessimistic sentiment than how people feel in the current environment. And so, can we say that as we look at the past year, the future has not been as bad as we thought it was going to be? Because we've never had a matching there at all, right? And so this is maybe just the way it is. It's definitely something in year two. We'll have to see if this kind of trend continues.
Yeah. And so as we look into year two, we're going to go through that same sort of cycle, but we're going to have a new data point, which is going to be comparing every month to the annual benchmark. So let's say 85 is the number. We're going to be looking at how are we different from that 85 as we move through the different production cycles. So anyway, that's where we stand on future farm financial performance.
Yeah. And if you think about the regionality of all this, Justin, if you just look at current farm financial performance for a second, you think about it, it's, how is my farm performing today versus 12 months ago? From Western Canadian standpoint, there is a bit of reduction in fertilizer prices for sure. But the weather has been less cooperative in 23 than 22 in Western Canada. So in some ways you would think that people would feel a little bit worse than they do on their current farm financial performance compared to a year ago.
Yeah. And, that's an important point too. And this is sort of similar to the state of mental health question that we ask. And I remember somebody making a comment about this in the open-ended block in the last survey that we did. They said, I answered the question that my mental health is worse than it was last year, but it's still pretty good. So this isn't taking into account the actual performance. It's relative to last year, and last year could have been outstanding. This year's still really good, but it's just not as good as last year,
Yeah.
So it's somewhat deceiving there. And so, when you see the 96, within a margin of error, I said the plus or minus 4%, you could argue that's just a neutral number right there.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on. The farm financial performance. Remember, this is the farmer answering the question based on their situation, and some of that could be based on feeling. Some of that could also be based on concrete data that they have. As we look at these next two questions, these are more opinion-based questions. So, how do you feel about the Canadian ag economy? Are we looking at good times ahead or bad times ahead? And as you can see here, this one has jumped all over historically, starting at that 86, going up to as high as 97, which, margin of error is relatively neutral. And then in the last intake, dropping down to 56. Well, we saw that one shoot back up again to 69. So, you could argue that there's some emotion attached to that. That might drop the numbers down and then back up again. But you can see that generally over the course of the year, this one has remained in negative territory. Now, this one is short term. This is, how do you think things are going to be in the next year? The future of the Canadian ag industry, are we in it for widespread good times or widespread bad times? And that's a 5-year outlook. Here you've seen sort of the similar trend. It hasn't gotten as high as the economy-based question, but in this case, you saw that the optimism sort of waned just a little bit, dropping down to a 62. So you definitely see that there's a downward trend there in the longer term outlook.
Yeah. So fascinating. So the future of the Canadian ag industry is the long term. And we were at 67. Now we're at 62. We're definitely in negative territory. Okay, we're at the same levels we were going back to last September when we first started this in September of 22. What's fascinating to me is that although Canadian farmers on a whole are pessimistic about the future of the Canadian ag industry, we've seen land prices continue to go up. We've seen profitability still strong. I'm curious what is driving the more negative sentiment on whether or not this is we're going to be in for good times or bad times as we look over a longer horizon. I'm right there with you in terms of some of the barriers and roadblocks and headways that are in front of us in terms of the Canadian ag economy in the short term, especially as we deal with some of the market volatility and having questions about what's happening with non-tariff trade barriers, weather, all of those kinds of things. But over the longer term, farmers seem pretty pessimistic here, but I'm not sure it's showing up in some of their actions. Mm-hmm. And so that's what's really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of why I referenced that in the first two blocks, farm financial performance, farmers very much in control of those things. They have control over those things. They have less control over these second two blocks. And, maybe it's that feeling like I don't have control over things that creates the pessimism. Sean, we've also done a lot of surveys that focus on things like government policy and regulation and things like that. And, that could be weighing these numbers down as well as just sort of how people feel about those sorts of things that are beyond their control that could impact their, the overall future of the industry.
Yeah, a bit of a sneak peek here. I believe in August here, we're going to be, our issues-based survey is going to be about interest rates and inflation and the impact on farmers' decision-making, which also leads us to confidence in making farm investments, our next module here in the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. But that has to be, I would think, an overhang that is sort of clouding how people feel about the current environment and the future.
Yeah, I would agree. So confidence in making farm investments. This one has not really varied from the beginning. A little bit of a decline, which was interesting because in November, when we did the second intake, it came just on the heels of an interest rate announcement. And you see the number has pretty much stabilized. Well, no surprise, it continues to be stable. And so the number is 52. I mean, I think that's just where we stand on that one. There are some farmers who feel it's a good time. It's rare. But for all intents and purposes, this is not the time to be making those large scale investments in equipment, in land and things like that.
Yeah. No, it's, we have not moved that might be, well, I don't want to, state of mental health is another one where we just have not seen much movement. The standard deviation of the results across the 12 months is quite low.
Yeah. Yeah. Calculating the averages here is going to be pretty easy and predictable. Confidence in marketing crops. So this one, we saw from the beginning, relatively neutral, a trend downwards all the way to 79. If you kind of follow what was going on in commodity markets, I think people sort of question their ability to be good at marketing. In this intake, and consider the time frame, July 20th, 21st is when we started. It shot back up a little bit, getting closer to that neutral line. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next time we do this. If that number continues to go up, this is likely very highly related to what's going on in the markets. Outlook.
I was just going to say, I want to see, let pull up outlook on selling crops and we can relate it to.
So this one, if you've done the surveys before and you've watched these videos, you'll see we talk about this one a lot. And even in the last one, we asked, sort of where are you with respect to inventory? Like, how much of your crop have you sold of this year's crop and last year's crop? This number took a big dip from September to November. And then another dip and a steady downward climb as we got into May. In this intake, look at that. That one's really shot up. And so the question is phrased as, I should be selling my crop now because prices are going down. That's the negative variable. Or I should be holding my crop because prices are going up. And what this is telling us is that, a large proportion of farmers seem to think that these prices are going to continue, they're going to go up. And so that's a very positive outlook, and it's reflected in the size of that bar.
I think this is representative of what I've been hearing from the audience. It's not representative of what I've been hearing from commodity analysts. But when I talk to farmers, this has two things written all over it. Geopolitical disruption, wondering what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. And, there are some what ifs that would really limit Russian and Ukrainian grain exports that would really disrupt the market. I think it was this week we got a Ukraine grain export number that still shows that grain's leaving the area. So that's one of the reasons why the market's had a really kind of a tough ride here in the first week of August. But I think weather market is all over this. Okay. So farmers are looking out in their field. They're talking to their neighbors for the most part in the Midwest and in Western Canada. And they're not liking what they see. And so there's been a lot of talk here for the past number of weeks, including when we did this intake about the weather market. And so I think that is, so when we do the next survey in September, it'll be very fascinating because then we're going to have a much better idea. Like the weather market premium will be out. It'll either be reality or it'll be evaporated. And so we'll have a much better idea as far as where things stand. And I think the confidence number at 91 kind of fits it's reasonable, I think, because I understand how you could have low confidence in trying to sort this out, especially if you're in an area that you're concerned about your yield. Right? Is how do I have confidence trying to take advantage of these high, these prices while they're here, but not commit myself to something I can't contractually, meet those obligations. So I think this is very representative right now in terms of the crux that farmers are in. I had Ted Seifert from Zaner Ag Hedge on Real Ag Radio last week. Yeah, last week. And what he talked about is, a little bit different than what you're seeing here in this 138 is that although there is a narrative for the market to go higher and people have a very bullish outlook, there's also a lot of risk to the downside here if this weather market just evaporates. And that's the kind of week that we've had here in the first week of August. And so don't be complacently bullish. So there is some risks here right now that everybody needs to be obviously aware of. But I think this describes how people are feeling based on the feedback I've gotten anecdotally.
Yeah, and just eyeballing the data too. One thing I should point out, there's a big difference between Eastern farmers and Western farmers on this one. Western farmers are significantly more on the bullish side than the Eastern-based farmers. So
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
And canola is an example of the rest of the market is having a down day, and canola is green on the screen, and repeatedly. Canola has had an exceptional movement to the upside up until this week, actually. But yeah, it's drought. That's that weather market. That weather market premium is driving those numbers higher on spring wheat and on especially on canola.
So the last block of bars we're going to look at here are related to the state of mental health. And here we ask the question, do you feel that your state of mental health is in a better position, a worse position, or about the same as last year? And so again, how somebody answers this question, better could be already from a pretty good spot, or it could be from not a good spot. And so it's not... It may be the best measurement of someone's true state of mental health, but it does give us an idea as to now how the number is fluctuating. And I think you sort of referenced this earlier. We haven't seen a tremendous amount of change in this one. The standard deviation is not great. And so our conclusion is that farmers are pretty neutral when it comes to the state of mental health, which personally, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. So, I'm happy to see these numbers where they are. And of course we'd like to see them continue to increase. But I think that we should be pretty happy. And I think that what this does not show us are the actual responses to the questions. Like there's only a small percentage of people who say I'm better off and only a small percentage of people who say I'm worse off. The majority opt for that sort of neutral response, which is I'm about the same as I was before.
I was just going to ask you that question. What percent of people said I'm same as before?
Yeah, it's like 10%.
10% said they're the same?
Oh, sorry, it's that I'm same as before?
Yeah.
It's like 80%.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like 80%. So we're looking at the bulk of the group, the vast majority.
Right. And once again, it's relative to how I felt 12 months ago.
Right.
Okay. So just keep that in mind. There's people that are going to feel they were really good 12 months ago and they still feel good. And there's people that are going to feel really crappy 12 months ago and maybe still feel really crappy because it still hasn't rained on their ranch and they have no grass. Right. Yeah. So, but everybody's answering in reflection of now versus the past. So, definitely, depending on where you fit on that scale, there's always room to do some self work and try to help yourself improve some of your mental health and do some work there. So,
and reach out to others who may need that support as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. With this one, I do think it's interesting how the trend sort of follows the production cycle. When we first did the intake, it was in harvest time and it was a little lower. And then as we got into November, we see the results coming in of the year's work we've done. And then we get into the winter where maybe we're taking some downtime, some self-care, and we get to that neutral point. And then we get back into spring and it dips down a little bit. And so, this is 1 year's worth. It'll be interesting to see what next year is like if it follows that exact same trend. I think that will end up telling us an awful lot about, the stress of farming.
Something I'm going to do is dig in here a little bit on this confidence of making farm investments. I'm going to, because, I did an interview with AGI at Ag in Motion, and they talked about how strong the business is. On things like bins and handling systems and things like that. That fits in that category. So it's going to be interesting. I think we should look at year-to-date machinery sales, look at things like infrastructure. Some of the companies are selling those, and see actually and kind of look at it and see, like, are farmers saying it's not a good time, but they're still doing it, or is there actual or are things really slowing down in the spending department because of things like interest rates? I think there's more analysis to be done there. And like I said, in August, we're definitely going to be looking at interest rates and inflation.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, hey, want to thank everybody for responding to the survey. 593 farmers and ranchers across the country is absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much for doing this. I really think it really provides the market with, and when I say the market, I mean stakeholders, whether that's farm groups or companies, fellow farming peers, a real bit of an insight into what's happening inside the farmer and rancher's mind and how they're looking at the industry of agriculture and their own operations right now. So this is important work, and thank you for participating, everybody. If you do have any feedback, make sure you send it to Justin or myself, shaney@RealAgriculture.com, or you can always call the Real Ag listener line, I guess, too, 855-776-6147. On behalf of Justin and myself, happy harvest to everybody, and we'll see you again next month. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.